It's a great question, and it really comes down to the culture of the Chinese Communist Party. When the party was attempting to achieve power or support in society, they had to rally together a lot of forces that would be negatively impacted by the imposition of a Marxist regime. So, they had to get support from religious elements who would subsequently be closed down because Marx regards religion as the opiate of the people and distracting from revolutionary purposes. They needed the support from the private sector, and so they defined patriotic capitalists at the time, knowing full well that once they came into power, that the businesses would be nationalized and the private businessmen would lose their businesses. And so they've had a tradition of deception, trying to convince people that their program, in this case domestic and international, is not what it really is, and that they pose less of a threat than they really do. And so in the course of their discourse, they're spontaneously able to dissemble in self-interested ways, because that's what allowed them to strategically achieve the success of their revolution and make the fundamental transformation of Chinese society. And so, when you're dealing with China, one has to be aware that what they say is not their ultimate program, but what they're telling you in the interim, so that you'll feel confident that you can collaborate with the Chinese communists and that it will be of mutual benefit and that they won't ultimately be turning against you. I think in the case of Canada, China attempts to disguise their intention, which is to suppress discussion which would impact negatively on the regime, or suppress their overall program of attempting to gain control of Canadian natural resources and achieving a relationship with Canada that would serve the increase of power of the Chinese Communist regime. So, it really becomes a question of decoding their intentions. And I mean, while one might see it as bald-faced lying, it really is consistent with how the party has traditionally functioned, and this idea of using what they refer to as united front tactics to achieve their strategic ends is baked right into the culture of Chinese communism. So euphemism might be a word, strategic deception might also be an aspect of it. Well, I think if we start with the community of the shared future for mankind, or sometimes translated as the community of the common destiny of mankind, this is a device that Xi Jinping has been emphasizing in his public statements, particularly since 2017, which functions to rally support for the autocratic Chinese Communist regime's rule of China by claiming that the Chinese Communist Party is the inheritor of the Chinese tradition, and that Chinese communism is consistent with the norms of Chinese civilization. And in ancient times, China regarded its emperor as the sole legitimate political figure on the planet. And the emperor ruled over Tianxia, in other words, all of heaven. And that the emperor had a special relationship with the cosmic forces of heaven that gave him the authority over the temporal realm. And China was aware of other nations and peoples but regarded them as subordinate to the spiritual and temporal authority of the Chinese emperor, which was determined through various forms of ritual. The community of the common destiny of mankind, or the shared future of mankind, suggests that the movement of global geostrategic relations is towards Chinese domination of the entire planet and all nations. And this project is being gradually undertaken through, first of all, economic means, through the Belt and Road Initiative, the massive infrastructural program linking all parts of the world with China. All those belts and roads ultimately terminate in China as the center of the world, and that ultimately Chinese political and cultural norms, and possibly the language, will assume a hegemonic authority over all of us wherever we are. That's Xi Jinping's ultimate intention, based on this notion that this is a sacred mission of the Chinese people to become the superior civilization to which all the rest of us are subordinate. So, this audacious plan, which Xi Jinping suggests China would implement by 2050, it seems unlikely, but anyway, that's his ideology, is supplemented by this idea of the multipolar world, where Xi Jinping is attempting to justify Chinese domination of the region initially. He feels that in a multipolar world, I guess it would be like the U.S. Monroe Doctrine, where the United States would have domination over, at present, Western Europe and the Americas, and Russia would have domination of what was the Russian Empire, Eastern Europe and Russia, and that China would expand over the South China Sea, and now we're seeing more and more Chinese incursions into waters around Australia. China's desire to dominate the Korean peninsula by subverting the South Korean regime, and of course recovery of Taiwan, and China's increasing domination of countries like Cambodia and Laos, which border the current People's Republic of China. So the multipolar world seems to be part of this euphemistic, as one might say, strategic deception, as China ultimately hopes to dominate the entire planet. So, it might give the Americans and the Russians a sense of confidence that we can divide up the world into these great spheres of great power influence, but ultimately China's plan is to dominate everything and to subvert, I think, first of all, the U.S. authority, China regarding the U.S. as a power in decline, and then by gradually bringing the Soviets into a position underneath the great power of China. So the multipolar world, I guess, eventually would be subsumed by the community of the common destiny of mankind, or the community of the shared future of mankind, when Xi Jinping achieves his ultimate aim, which is to become the emperor figure over all of us. So we should be worried about China's attempts to gain influence throughout the world and in Canada. And currently, I think we have a lot of concern about Chinese activities in the northern part of Canada, attempting to achieve shipping routes and access to our natural resources to further strengthen China at the expense of us. So the multipolar world is the precedent to the community of the common destiny of mankind. To what extent China can achieve this goal is very much in question, particularly with the downturn in the Chinese economy and overextension perhaps in the third world. But it is the intention of the regime And therefore, when we see Chinese international activity, we should understand that underlying it is the overall goal of global domination, whether it's in assisting African countries in developing port facilities that could later be used for geostrategic purposes by Chinese submarines or other naval facilities, or simply the subversion of foreign politicians to get them to turn a blind eye to Chinese influence operations and attempts to gain control of natural resources. All of these things ultimately are being regarded by Beijing as building blocks to achieve their ultimate end of global domination.
You mentioned about 2050 as an important year for PRC, which would mark basically the foundation and 100th anniversary of the foundation of PRC. And with that brings me this another widely used, perhaps one of the most important mechanisms, or rather kind of a strategic deception, or the vision for Xi Jinping, which is the national rejuvenation of Chinese nation. Could you speak a bit about this goal in context with what you just explained in terms of creating a community of combined destiny?
Yeah, those definitely fit together. I think the translation of national rejuvenation seems to contain the idea of youthfulness, but in the Chinese it's really about creating a national excitement. And I think it's about China achieving domination of technology and infrastructure, and being at the cutting edge of global development economically and culturally. And so, as you point out, the 2050 would mark 100 years since the establishment of the People's Republic of China, and also sort of 200 years since China's perception of humiliation by the Western powers and Japan in the period after the defeat of China in the Opium Wars in 1842. And so I think that Xi looks out and sees the great scope of history and puts perhaps undue emphasis on China being weakened by Western imperialist colonialism in those 100 years prior to the victory of the Chinese Communist Party reunifying China under Mao Zedong ideology and Marxism-Leninism. So it's an idea of China developing a sense of confidence and redressing humiliation and becoming the great and exciting power in the world, perhaps at the expense of everybody else, which is why I think China takes such pride in their current accomplishments in things like high-speed trains and deep-seek AI and electric vehicles, where China sees itself as no longer being the sick man of Asia and behind the Western powers, but exceeding the nations of the world that China perceives as having humiliated China, and which China, I think, wrongly perceives as desiring to keep China's rise suppressed out of racist motivations. China reads the history that way and sees any actions taken by nations to try and counter China's influence, expansion activities, and malign dissembling as anti-China racism. And this is unfortunate because, of course, in a better world, we would all be working together to bring about economic development and elimination of poverty and extending justice to all peoples. And it doesn't mean that there has to be a zero-sum game where China's rise must be accompanied by the fall of other great civilizations and cultures.
This insecurity insecurity that seems to be stemming from China's perception about the Western country seems to have resulted domestically a more assimilationist policy, especially targeting, Tibetans, Uyghurs, and that at a policy level, that resulted into the development of what they call ethnic autonomy law, and the use of certain euphemism like promoting the unity of nationality, maintaining social stability, re-education, vocational training center. So all this euphemism, when you hear it, it sounds like a very benign, well-intentioned program, but when its actual implementation, it seems to be designed to create a sinicization of the minority into one nation, Chinese nation. Could you speak into those euphemisms, and also about this what China calls Chongguo Minzu, which seems to be somewhere as kind of a root behind all of this euphemisms?
I think in the early years of communism, before the victory over the nationalists, that the Chinese Communist Party saw the future of China as a sort of federation of the great civilizations that have existed traditionally over the territory that we now define as the People's Republic of China. So I think that Chairman Mao and others saw the nation as an alliance between the Mongolians, the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, and the Han. And so, China recognized that while the Han were much more numerous, that in fact the traditional lands of Tibetans and Uyghurs and Mongols takes up a very large proportion of the territory of what is now defined as the People's Republic of China. So in the early period, there was this idea of allowing autonomy for different ethnic groups and cultures and languages, and these autonomous regions, including the Tibet Autonomous Region and the Uyghur Autonomous Region, and autonomous counties and autonomous prefectures, where people would be able to be masters of their own societies in accordance with their own religious, civilizational, and linguistic realities. And so, this led to the idea of autonomous regions. But here again, the definition of autonomy, as you point out, was euphemistic, because the expectation of Marxism-Leninism was that all the religions and cultures would fade away, and that a new socialist man would be emerged based on Marxist ideals. That dream rapidly faded. I guess probably the last gasps of the idea of creating this selfless mass of the people who would defer their own individual aspirations to the socialist collective would have ended with the failure of the great proletarian cultural revolution in the late 1970s. So what we have now is that under Xi Jinping, he seems to de-emphasize the idea that the People's Republic of China is composed by the 56 ethnic minorities, as they put it, that the Communist Party officially recognized. Of course, there are a lot of peoples in China who feel that they should be gaining recognition as unique civilizational and ethnic groups who have been merged into other groups. But anyway, so you have the 56. But then Xi Jinping adopted this idea of, as you say, the Zhonghua Minzu, which means the central flowery ethnicity, or the Chinese ethnicity, which had never existed before. Chinese was a a nation concept, but it was not an ethnic concept. Most of the people in China are of Han ethnicity, and we refer to them in English as Chinese, but properly we should be not referring to Chinese Canadians, but Han Canadians, because people who come from China, from the People's Republic of China, who are not Han, would not identify themselves as Chinese Canadians. I don't think any Tibetan would shake your hand and say, yes, I'm a Chinese Canadian, or a Uyghur wouldn't define themselves as Chinese Canadian. Of course, they identify based on their ethnic and civilizational background, not on belonging to the People's Republic of China. So under Xi Jinping, you're seeing a process whereby the ethnic identity is, he's attempting to eliminate that ethnic identity through assimilation programs. So, we know about the Uyghur, what's referred to as re-education facilities, ostensibly designed to give persons of Uyghur ethnicity Chinese language skills and other skills to allow them to participate in a modern economy. But the process of this re-education is not to permit them, while in these facilities, which are really prisons in the sense that they have high walls and razor wire and guards with guns preventing people from leaving them. The idea is that people in those facilities cannot practice their Islamic religion or engage in activities of the Uyghur culture, reading Uyghur philosophy or literature, or engaging in Uyghur festivals, and even Uyghur food and drink customs are not allowed, and encouraging the Uyghurs to drink alcohol or eat non-halal foods, particularly pork, and encouraging intermarriage of the Uyghurs with the Han Chinese, and transportation of Uyghurs to eastern coastal parts of China to work in factories where they would be surrounded by Han Chinese, not Uyghurs. And then we have the change in curriculum in schools for Tibetan children, which previously had a strong emphasis on the Tibetan language and culture, that have now been converted almost entirely to Mandarin Chinese, and the teaching of the history, really, of the Han people, not the history of the Tibetan people. So under Xi Jinping, it seems that he hopes to eliminate cultural and civilizational differences and assimilate everybody living within the territory of the People's Republic of China into the modern Han communist Chinese mainstream culture. I am not confident that this policy can succeed. My feeling is that, for example, once Tibetan children become educated, they will not be content to deny their ancestral, traditional, civilizational past, but in fact will be emboldened to become more Tibetan, even if they don't have strong facility in the language. The identity will sustain. So I hope that in future the Chinese government will reverse this kind of program and allow Tibetans to celebrate their Tibetan civilizational traditions in educational facilities. I mean, of course, it's important that all children should have access to modern education and knowledge of modern culture, but religion, civilizational norms, culture are what's most precious to the souls of man. And the attempt by Xi Jinping to assimilate all of the 56 nationalities into the Han Chinese mainstream is a tragic policy that I think will end very, very badly.
And finally, I wanted to discuss this. Here in Canada, the last few years, the topic of foreign interference has been has picked up a kind of a momentum and has received a good amount of attention from media, government, parliament, and a big part of the focus is on China. That reminds me that China, when it comes to kind of any um, suggestion or what they would claim as a kind of accusation about issues of human rights violation, they bring up this policy of non-interference in internal affairs, which again may seem like a really benign euphemism, but which is also frequently used by Beijing to deflect criticism on Tibet and East Turkestan issues. And yet today we see China increasingly getting involved in other countries here in Canada's national politics. So how does this contradiction play out?
Well, I think it is part of this dissembling euphemistic strategy that you're talking about. I mean, we know that the Chinese cohort of diplomats in Canada is much, much larger than necessary to fulfill normal diplomatic functions. So, you know, China has had, I think, 6 times as many diplomats in Canada than India. Why do they have so many? And I think that it's reasonable to assume, and there has been evidence by former CSIS officers in the Parliament of Canada, that something like 70% of the Chinese diplomatic cohort is engaged in these influence operations. And, you know, the operations are probably based on 2 strategies. One is to try and subvert influential policymakers in Canada through providing promise of benefits or psychological manipulation or even blackmail to get them to not oppose China's activities in Canada designed to strengthen China's rise, such as espionage, obtaining of dual-use technologies through collaborations with Canadian universities or through just straight good old cyber espionage, that the policymakers would not aggressively seek to stop this activity because they have a conflict of interest due to benefits that they may be receiving from the Chinese Communist regime. So we're not seeing as much action to expel Chinese diplomats who are engaged in activities that are not consistent with the Vienna Convention diplomatic relations, and we're still allowing Chinese scientists to collaborate with Canadians, engaging in targeted transfer of technologies that China needs to feed its military and economic rise. And we see these activities of harassment and menace and subversion of people in Canada who, largely because they have diaspora relationships with oppressed groups within China, seek to shape Canadian public opinion to be more aware of the true nature of the Chinese Communist regime. So, you know, the idea that China opposes non-interference is pretty much the opposite of the reality, which is that China wants to expand its influence and interfere in Canada based on its own tradition of united front work, which worked effectively within China to further Chinese Communist goals, and is designed to try and soften up and prepare for ultimately the Chinese domination of Canada through the community of the common destiny of mankind. So it is highly hypocritical, and certainly I think it's perfectly legitimate for the Government of Canada and for NGOs to raise awareness of China's violation of international law and the United Nations covenants that China has ratified, by pointing out that China's policies towards Uyghurs, Tibetans, Mongolians, and others, are violations of the norms of international covenants that the international community should not stand idly by and allow to go on, despite the fact that they're largely happening within the confines of a sovereign nation. And China certainly has no trouble in trying to establish moral equivalence between Canadian violations of human rights in the past, such as comparing the system of boarding schools in Tibet with suggesting that they compare favorably to the residential schools that Indigenous people were subjected to in Canadian history. So China certainly wants to have a one-sided communication in these regards, and I think it's important that we not be cowed by this kind of Chinese whataboutism, or this kind of rhetoric trying to assert sovereignty of China, when China's violating international norms that help create the rules-based international order that maintains peace and justice in the world.